Welcome to Laurier's Teaching Excellence Conversation Series. I'm Mary Wilson, Vice Provost of Teaching and Learning at Wilfrid Laurier University. And throughout this series, I'll be joined by recipients of the Donald F. Morgenson Awards for Teaching Excellence to celebrate their exceptional teaching practices, learn about their teaching philosophies, and discuss the future of teaching and learning. Today, I'm with Jayne Kalmar from Laurier's Department of Kinesiology and Physical Education in the Faculty of Science. Jayne received the 2020 Faculty Mentoring Award. Jayne's nomination centered on her thoughtful and purposeful approach to mentorship and deep dedication to student learning, along with her breadth of mentorship experience and her success her students have gone on to. Welcome, Jayne.
Thank you.
Jayne, let's chat a little bit about how you work to develop students' research competencies through your approach to mentorship of students.
Well, it's an interesting experience to bring a student into the laboratory because for the most part, and this is true for undergraduate students as well as graduate students, it's their first experience in a human neurophysiology lab. And so some students come in with some trepidation because they're not walking into something that they can already do. So there's a lot of hands-on learning, and that really suits some students who are, a little tired of sitting in lecture halls and ready for something that's a little bit more practical. So we dive in right away. I have students who are new to the lab assisting, more senior students. And I'm in the lab. I have an office in the lab as well, so I'm there to assist. And so it's sort of a trial by fire. Get in there, get your hands on the equipment, and don't be afraid to actually do the practical side of research right from the start.
That requires some development of the senior students as well. So you also coach them in practices and how to help facilitate the learning of students who are, it's an adjustment, as you say, for students to be in that lab space instead of a lecture space or a seminar space or a study hall to really learn deeply, as dynamically as you need to in an active learning environment.
Yeah, that's true. And I think one of the things I've learned since I started and my lab opened, I think back in 2009, I used to think that you could just put a senior student and a new student together and, mentorship would just magically happen. And found out that that's not always the case, that we actually have to learn to become mentors. And part of that learning comes from being mentored well. And I was very fortunate to have excellent mentors. And part of it comes from a little bit of direction. So teaching students how to interact and how to show someone a skill and how to provide feedback that allows for some growth rather than, make someone feel incompetent or makes them, more scared to approach the skill and try to perfect it.
Yeah, I was, as we're talking about this, thinking about a tradition in clinical education in health sciences that must be highly akin to kinesiology, where particularly for nurse educators, they take an approach that's tied to what they call entrustable professional practice, where you have a senior mentor who demonstrates a procedure or an approach or an interaction with a client or a patient, and then they coach the novice through that. And then the next time there's reflection in between, and then the novice will repeat that activity independently with the observation of the senior mentor. There's feedback again, and then you build up the ability to act independently with fewer check-ins. So is that a model that is in keeping with how you approach that work in the lab?
Yes, it is. That actually reflects very well what we do. I mean, one of the challenges in the lab that I run is that some of our work is invasive. And so, so I do intramuscular recordings, which requires the insertion of fine wires into, in our case, a superficial muscle. And so there's also the consideration of making whoever the participant is, or the trainee, if we're in a learning situation and we're not conducting an experiment, making that person feel comfortable, which is sort of an added challenge to this type of mentorship. It can be a stressful environment. So, we do start with a senior student demonstrating a skill on me, so that, nobody's worried, or maybe they're not as worried about how the participant is feeling. And then we would move on to two students practicing with each other, so that, we don't have the element of somebody outside the lab sitting in the data collection room and being practiced on. So that's an interesting challenge in the lab. It's more, it comes more easily to some students than to others.
I imagine you go to a great deal of care to frame those experiences and prepare students for what to observe, what to pay attention to in that integration of, attending to the procedure, but also to the person who you're interacting with. Can you walk us through that a little bit, and how you set up those experiences for your students and then move them to the experimentation of it themselves?
Yeah, it's one of the things that's important is for the student to experience the process themselves. And I mean, there's not all students are comfortable with all the procedures in the lab. So I try to match them up with an experiment that they are comfortable with, and they will see themselves what it's like to sit in the chair. Some of the experiments last for, an hour, and what does it feel like to sit still for, a long period of time and pay attention to instructions and stare at a screen. And so that's sort of the first step, knowing how the research participant is going to feel. And then, as I said, a considerable amount of practice among the students, so that there's a feeling of competency and success before they actually have to collect real data, before the pressure's really on.
It matters enormously, I think, for student success in those research-facing experiences or lab-centered practical field work, et cetera, how they learn in those spaces, the quality of the mentorship that is available to them. And you've clearly grappled with this extensively. So when you think about some of the key features of consequential mentorship models, what would you say those are? What would you advise other educators to really focus on?
We have to recognize, and not just recognize, but truly appreciate the diversity of students that we have working with us. And I mean diversity in the broadest sense. There are students who have wildly different educational backgrounds. So not all of my master's students are coming out of a kinesiology program. Some of them come from biology, some from biomedical sciences. So they have that diversity in their educational credentials, but they also have different experiences outside the lab. I have students who are parents. I have students who are, trying to, get through those early life events, like first relationships or buying houses, moving. I have students from out of province. I have students who have significant responsibilities for family members, parents or siblings, or their own children. And I think if we really want people to embrace life in the laboratory and research, then we have to allow them to fit that into their lives, which can be quite different than our own. And I mean, I think that's something that people are trying to do better. But I think it does require some sort of conscious consideration. And it's easy to complain about a student who's not there precisely when you want them to, or has a life event that's slowed them down with their research or prevented them from meeting some milestone. But often those are really legitimate, and we want those people to stay in research. I was really fortunate because when I was doing my PhD, I was in my late 20s, mid to late 20s, and I wanted to start a family, and I was a little afraid to tell my PhD advisor, I'm not sure why I was afraid, but I was afraid to tell him that my husband at the time, that he and I had wanted to start our family. And so when I did say, oh, you know what, I'm pregnant, I'm going to have a baby in the end of my first year of my PhD, it was met with happiness. He was extremely supportive. Oh, this is the best time to have a baby. This is a good time for you to start a family. And it was such a relief to me. And I think if that had not been the case, I think trying to fit my life in the lab with my life outside the lab may have pushed me further away from this career instead of sort of welcoming me to it.
And I imagine that approach has echoed forward for you as an educator and how you think about students holistically and think about their work as researchers, as future contributors to academia or to research labs or practice spaces, and that they need to live a well-rounded and balanced life and find joy in the work that we do. Can you talk a little bit about how you learned about mentorship and supervision and the ways in which you've integrated that into other components of your teaching practice?
Yes. Well, I did my graduate studies at York University. And I was really fortunate when I started my master's to have worked with Dr. Enzo Caffarelli. And he was a phenomenal mentor. He ran a small lab. It wasn't, filled with a large research team. We had maybe 4 to 6 students in the lab at any time. He was very hands-on in the lab, supervising us, showing us skills, and as I said, very accommodating to our lives outside the lab. So I did learn a lot from my academic mentors, and I went on to do my PhD with Dr. Caffarelli as well. I had an excellent postdoctoral mentor, Dr. Phil Gardner at the University of Manitoba. That was an excellent mentorship relationship as well, where we got to know each other's families in the lab. We worked together, we socialized together. Sometimes our work felt social. So I think that certainly helped me develop my own mentorship skills. And then in terms of bringing that to my own students, both in the lab and in the classroom, I think I've appreciated the value of a small research team. I really love the classes where I'm able to mingle with students. So one of my classes, whenever I can, I teach in an active learning classroom where students are in sort of a modular setup, 6 students sitting together in a group of desks. They each have their own whiteboard. I do a little bit less talking, can limit my sort of lecture components to 15, 20 minutes at a time. And then students work together so that there's a little bit of peer mentorship for students who understand a certain area of the course better than others. Some students are good writers, some students are good problem solvers, and they can actually work together and teach each other. And I can walk around more easily in that environment than in a really large lecture hall. So I think that's one of the ways that I have brought research mentorship a little bit into the classroom.
I can anticipate as well that would make a big difference for the culture of your labs. So I know that within the sciences, there's often a perception in our students that they're entering into a really competitive environment in which they are going to have to find their own successes, that they're anticipating they're not going to get a lot of support, that they're meant to rise or fall on their own accord. And it sounds as though you create these really supportive environments where peers are provided not only with the tools, but also the encouragement to help each other to progress in their research, in their thinking, in their problem solving, and that you are playing more of a coaching and mentorship role. But I imagine you endeavor to ensure that there are no misconceptions that are left unaddressed. Is that something that you find that you have to attend to quite often, that you're checking to make sure that students are progressing well?
Yeah, that's important as well. Some students I've found over the years are reluctant to say when they can't do something. And I'm not sure whether that's because they're afraid of disappointing me or because they don't want to measure up in their own minds as less than someone else in the lab. But that is something that I'm more actively looking for now. So we have lab meetings at least once a week. Right now, we've just started doing a Monday morning meeting to get set up for the week and a Friday meeting to sort of break down how the week went. So we meet as a group, we present problems that we're having. I ask students to demonstrate new skills or new analysis techniques. So there's a lot of teamwork going on a weekly and day-to-day basis in the laboratory. And I think when a problem is identified, it's important to remind a student that actually we deal with more problems than successes on a day-to-day basis in science. I think sometimes students look at the articles that they're reading when they're doing their review of literature, and an article always looks like whatever was done easily. There's the purpose and the hypotheses at the beginning, and then there's this, beautiful results section, and then a discussion like, of course we found this. And so it can be shocking for students when, every day there's a new roadblock and, oh, this didn't work. And I thought this was going to happen and that didn't work. And I can't even get this piece of equipment to turn on. And I got this one to turn on, but then it stopped working halfway through an experiment. And so I think it's really important to tell students, oh yeah, that's science. That's actually science. And so being a good scientist is also being resilient and being able to get through a really crappy day and look forward to figuring out how to make it work the next day. And also being able to look at your team around you and ask for help, because it's a lot easier to get through those bad days when you've got other people, going along on that journey with you.
I can just think of how your students benefit from that kind of culture and coaching, and that building of awareness that science is indeed fraught with repeatedly failed experiments where you learn from that, and that there's rich learning from that. And as you say, that the articles that are produced are the polished outcome of a great deal of trial and tribulation to get to the point where you've run a successful experiment and found results that are consequential. You had talked about the importance of your mentors and the models that you benefited from. Are there any other resources, pieces of literature, conferences that you've been to that have also really shaped your teaching practice?
Yeah, I mean, on a few fronts, really. I mean, first of all, I'll say I'm in an exceptional department. The Department of Kinesiology is interesting because we have a huge breadth of researchers. We have historians, philosophers, psychologists, biomechanists and physiologists. And so we have a real wild breadth of expertise. And despite that wide breadth, we are a very cohesive unit. We're very supportive of each other. When I was a new faculty member, I had tremendous support, and I have close colleagues now who I can turn to when I'm having trouble in the laboratory, when I need a little help figuring out how to help a student along. My students have great thesis advisory committee members from our department. So I'm really fortunate in that regard. In Ontario, and actually spreading across Canada now, we have a great group called the Exercise Neuroscience Group. And it was started actually by my mentor, Dr. Caffarelli, and his group of close colleagues, probably 30 years ago now. And that is a group that just grows every year. Every year, somebody's student, starts their own research program, and then they bring their students. And so I have a group of colleagues now that I've known since we were students, and we stretch across Canada now from the West Coast to the East Coast. We get together every 2 years. This conference is run every 2 years. And that's a great network for me but also a great network for my students, because those conferences are small, they're student-centered, there's a lot of social activity, so that a master's student or an undergraduate student, a PhD or a postdoctoral trainee can meet other people in the field and find new mentors and make new connections and consider new research opportunities. And that has been probably one of the strongest resources for me and for my students over the last few years.
You're speaking to a notion that is actually well grounded in research literature around faculty development for teaching strengths, that it is often within those significant networks and communities of practice that are built on trust, where educators can have conversations about how you design your courses, how you deal with dynamics in the classroom, how you choose to assess and structure those experiences for students that happen informally and dynamically and on an ongoing basis across somebody's career. And that is so meaningful in finding purpose in our teaching and expanding our practice and feeling part of a team of educators who are working collectively throughout all of the courses and experiences of a program to really develop students holistically. So I think it's a brilliant example of how that research literature into significant networks and communities of practice has come to life for one of our award-winning educators.
Mm-hmm.
When you think ahead, Jayne, to the future of teaching, in your discipline, what do you see on the horizon? What are you excited about?
Yeah, it's no shock, I don't think, to anybody to realize that the classroom sizes are growing, they're getting bigger, and we have to become really creative in the way that we teach students now. I think it's not that it's harder, it's that it's not as immediate. We have to move away from some of the old tried and true methods of teaching and assessing students. So when I started at Laurier, I used the standard midterm, final exam, maybe a big assignment or an essay. And I'm switching now, I'm moving now towards a more back and forth method of assessment and learning with students. So I have students submit study notes for every module that I teach. I usually break my courses down into modules so that they're actually getting credit for slowing down and studying, for submitting evidence that they're thoughtfully going through the work on a regular basis. So that's a change that I've been doing now for probably 2-3 years for all of the courses that I teach. Marks for study notes, and they're templated study notes. So I think that's important. I think finding opportunities to work with students in small groups, in active learning classrooms, in virtual group work on Zoom, for example, and through other means in for example, tutorials. One of the courses that I teach has small labs for teaching orthopedic assessment. So anytime we can work in a small group and allow students the opportunity to practice a practical skill that supports the theoretical knowledge that you're teaching in the classroom, that's helpful. And I think that, the future of all of this is hard to predict. We've had rapid changes over the last year in the way that we deliver content using virtual platforms. So, I think it'll be interesting to see where it goes. For me, I'm going to continue to try to find opportunities to work with small groups, even if it is a large class.
And on that very insightful note, I really want to thank Jayne Kalmar from Laurier's Faculty of Science for joining me in conversation today. And to you, the audience, for joining us to celebrate teaching excellence and student success. I hope you'll join me again in the next conversation as I continue to celebrate our award recipients and highlight exceptional teaching at Laurier. Thank you.